in a universe full of ideas. We draw lightness from the dark to a place where opposites attract. Right meets left, positive touches negative, sparking an explosion of truth. Because politics makes strange bedfellows.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Strange Bedfellows. I'm your host, Lori Spencer, and along with me tonight is my lovely and talented co-host, Mr. Rick Walker from Maverick News. How's it going, Rick?
Just fine.
How's your Saturday night?
Here. It's we're about to find out because we have a great guest joining us. So
yes, we
I'm
do.
Really looking forward to this one.
All the
fellow
way
Canuckistanian.
Yeah, Canuckistanian, who's now all the way over in Poland.
Yeah.
I want to introduce everybody to our friend Mike Krupa, VotumTV. Some of you may know Mike. You might watch his YouTube channel. He's got a great show, has interviewed a lot of really interesting people, and does wonderful journalism. It's we've been trying to get Mike on the show for a while now, but the time difference it makes it crazy because you're like, what, 7 hours ahead over there?
With Rick, it's 6 hours. With you, Lori, it's 7. So yeah, we have to accommodate. Yeah.
Right. And I've been on your show and it was tricky working out the time difference, but we made it happen. And I just wanted to tell you a little bit about Michael. He's a historian and political commentator, currently completing his PhD on American paleo conservatism, also the host of VotumTV podcast about the history of Poland, and his work has appeared in a lot of different outlets, including the American Conservative and Consortium News. And you can check out Mike's work on Twitter at MG Krupa. We're friends on Twitter. And it is a real pleasure to welcome you to the show at last, Mike. And I've been wanting you to meet Rick Walker for a while because there's that Canada connection there.
Yeah, well, it's an honor to be here, guys. And Rick, I hope you managed to visit the local Tim Hortons to get the coffee for our talk today. I don't have a Tim Hortons, so I had just a regular home coffee. But yeah, hello to Canada. Hello to you guys. Great to be on the show.
It's fantastic to have you here. And I think that I think you and I will find a lot of common ground today.
Indeed. Looking forward to it.
Yes.
Definitely. Well, I've been bringing all these left-wingers and commies on the show, and I wanted to bring on somebody that Rick could relate to.
Indeed.
Someone who speaks the language, not only conservative, but has a Canadian past, and you guys will have a lot to relate to. So I always like to start at the beginning of the show because, of course, Strange Bedfellows is about opposites attracting, if you will, and people of different political ideologies finding common ground. But I'm always interested to find out more about our guests' current politics, how you would describe yourself politically, and your journey to get there. How did you get there?
Well, maybe start from the beginning. The way I became a Canuck, so to say, is me and my family and I, we immigrated to Canada. It was 1991. It was March of 1991. And I remember one of the first political memories that I had was when we were still in Poland. I would watch clips live from Operation Desert Storm on Polish television. And you see the laser guided bombs falling on Baghdad. And you had this feeling that things around you were changing because at that time, obviously, the Berlin Wall had just fallen. There were presidential elections in Poland where Lech Walesa won the first free Polish presidential elections since the interwar period. So even though I was 5 at the time, there was this feeling that there's something happening in the air, so to say. Plus the fact that me and my family were immigrating to Canada. So that was a big change in our life. But I remember that was sort of my first, political memory.
Do you mind if I ask, why Canada? Why did you come to Canada?
It was a combination of family separation that had to be sort of reunited again, and economic hardships in a way. Poland at the time was coming out of communism. There was a lot of uncertainty about where things were going to go. I mean, there was a lot of hope in the air, obviously. Everybody was listening to, the Scorpions at the time, that famous song.
Winds of change.
Winds of change, exactly. Every time I hear winds of change, I go back in my memory to 1991 because it was so prevalent then,
Yeah.
So there's a lot of hope in the air, but being realistic, people knew at the time, and there was a massive wave of immigration from Poland at the time to Canada, that this could go, one or two ways. It could be, economic malaise, or we could start anew and bring prosperity to Poland and rebuild things, I guess. So that was the main reason. When we came to Canada, I attended a Catholic primary school, Queen of Heaven in Mississauga, if anybody's watching. Hi, guys, my old pals and gals. And then Catholic high school in what used to be called Etobicoke, but now is just called Toronto. I prefer the old name because the GTA used to be divided into these nice subdivisions before, they centralized everything into what's now called the GTA. Although I myself personally lived in the so-called bedroom of Toronto, in that great city of Mississauga.
I think Rick weren't you just in Mississauga
Just
this
there
week?
yesterday.
Yeah.
There you go.
Strange coinky dink.
Strange coinky dink. Mississauga was very interesting for a time because I think ever since the late 70s up until a few years back, we only had one mayor. Her name was Hazel McCallion. She had a nickname, if I remember, Hurricane Hazel, because she did a lot of good work for the city. I think she should have a statue basically dedicated to her. And I think she was in politics up until like 98 years of age, I think, because she was she was really a fighter. I mean, she was advising Doug Ford, I think, for a time, and literally retired just a few years ago from the chair of mayor. So we basically entered a very interesting space in Canada. Now, Mississauga obviously had its huge share of, as we call it, Polonia, so Polish immigrants. As a matter of fact, the largest Polish parish outside of Poland is located in Mississauga on Kothra Road. It's a St. Maximilian Kolbe Roman Catholic Church. So basically, as time went on, my family was and is practicing Catholic, conservative, very patriotic in terms of Poland, and very aware of the situation in Poland. So during my time in Canada, we would always go to these local, meetings of Polish immigrants, the Polish community. Anybody would come from Poland, either political figures or, professors from universities. We would basically coalesce around the fact that we were living in a new country, but we haven't forgotten about the mother country. And obviously, as time went on, I was young, so I was brought up in Canada, basically. I was brought up as a Polish Canadian with the sense that I'm becoming Canadianized, but not forgetting about my roots. And one of the things that contributed to not forgetting about my roots, and I was born in Poland, even though I left when I was 5, were the fact that I joined up very early with the Polish Scouting Association in Canada. And the Polish Scouting Association has this great outpost for summer camps in Renfrew County, just under Algonquin Park and near about 2 hours drive out from Ottawa. And in that area of Renfrew County is actually the place where the first Polish immigrants came in the 19th century and settled there, along with the Irish beside them. And these immigrants were from the northern part of Poland called Kashuby, which at that time was part of Prussia, because as you know, Poland was partitioned for 123 years by 3 nations, Russia, Prussia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So when the Germans basically started pushing what was called Drang nach Osten in the 19th century, which is basically forced Germanization of the local Polish community, a lot of these people didn't agree to this policy, and they knew there was land being given out, crown land being given out in Canada. They got on a ship in Gdynia, and they sailed to Canada. And a lot of them settled in Renfrew County. And as a matter of fact, the region, you could see it on a map, because the region where they came from in Poland is called Kashuby. So they were a sort of an ethnic group within an ethnic group. It's sort of like the Sicilians are Sicilian, but they're also Italian. So the Kashubs, they have their own dialect. So they're Kashub, but they're Polish at the same time. So they came to Canada, and they started this community in near Barry's Bay, and what today is called the township of Wilno, or as we say in Polish, Wilno, but we accept the Canadian version of the name. And they settled there. And because I would go there basically every summer since 1996, basically for about 2 or 3 or 5 years, I think, and we'd go to cottaging there every summer, every winter, basically every Thanksgiving. Just for those who are not in the know, Canadians celebrate Thanksgiving in October, not in November. Yes, there are 2 Thanksgivings in North America. If you combine that with, so I had this sort of triangular approach to my upbringing, because at the same time I was being Canadianized, which is a natural process of assimilation. I was becoming very much aware of my Polish roots and more aware of this political situation in Poland. And at the same time, my, I guess, conservative outlook was being finessed. And I think one of the most profound moments where I think I reached a sort of, I guess, tipping point, in a way you could say, in the formation of my entire conservative outlook was April 2003, when I attended my first Latin Mass on Roncesvalles Avenue in Toronto at the Church of St. Vincent de Paul. I was 18 at the time, and I was hearing a lot about, the Latin Mass, what happened in the Catholic Church after the Second Vatican Council. And this was literally a year after John Paul II came to Toronto for World Youth Day in 2002. Now, obviously, John Paul II being Polish, that also had its influence. But I also had this feeling that, yeah, the Pope is Polish, but there's just a lot of things that my conservative soul did not like in the church. I would prefer more of a solemn mass, Gregorian chant instead of the kumbaya guitar playing. I think it was one priest who said to me once, who actually celebrated the Latin Mass, he said, there's the two differences between the Catholic liturgy before the 60s and after the 60s. Is if you can imagine the Blessed Virgin Mary standing beside the cross and playing the guitar. It's like, well, I can't imagine that, Father. That's a good point. Says, well, that's sort of the difference between the two liturgies. So I guess you can say that after 2003, I took a big step in a sort of autonomous conservative outlook on the world, because my parents, up until recently, actually, they weren't too keen on me attending the Latin Mass. They still preferred the national language mass, the so-called regular mass. But I was doing the Lord's work, I guess, in that sense. And in 2003, in the summer, I was accepted into the history department of the Catholic University of Lublin in Poland, which is the Catholic university, by the way, where the future Pope John Paul II lectured when he was still a cardinal for 24 years, I believe. So in a way, we can say a professor of my alma mater became Pope in 1978. So I left for Poland in October 2003, and I would come back to Canada for the summers to visit my parents. But I guess I became rerouted once again in Poland. And while in Poland, not only my political convictions became more crystal clear, but it became, I started opening up to networks in Poland of, MPs, politicians, people who were influential in the church, in the universities, in parliament, and so on, which basically opened up a whole new world for me, because in Canada, I was not thinking in any way seriously about entering politics. Although if I stayed, I might have come to that conclusion. But in Poland, all of a sudden, it became so clear. And I came back for good in October 2013. So it's going to be 10 years in October since I'm back in Poland, in the old country, so to say. And yeah, been politicking, writing, fighting the good fight, and smelling the incense every Sunday ever since, so to say.
So you lived in Canada for what, 30 years off and on?
If you take it, if you take the entire time that I was in Canada, it was 15 years. 15. Yeah.
Wow. That's amazing. How much have you traveled throughout Europe?
I've traveled quite extensively, mostly south and west. I think one of the most profound traveling experiences that I've had in Europe was in 2005, when I actually attended the funeral of John Paul II in Rome.
Oh, you did?
Which was kind of amazing, because it's one of those historical, whatever you think of the Pope, but a historical experience where at one point, literally, you saw the whole world gathered. You saw the future Pope, Joseph Ratzinger, and right next to him was George W. Bush. And right next to him was, Silvio Berlusconi, right? So it was pretty profound, despite the fact that you had to sleep on a cot the whole night because there was no way to enter into the VIP section on the so-called Via della Conciliazione, which is the main road which leads to the Vatican, to St. Peter's. But other than that, I've traveled to Germany quite a lot, Czech Republic, Slovakia. One of the places that I want to start experiencing and visiting in the future, I hope, and that obviously all depends on the recent unpleasantness in Ukraine. I'd love to visit Belarus. I'd love to visit Russia. I have friends and acquaintances who live there who are inviting me all the time. It's just right now it's kind of hard to fly direct to Moscow, unfortunately. I'd have to take reroute, so to say. But I've seen my share of Europe, although I definitely like to see more. I've been to Turkey, went there for a week with my wife, very interesting country. But I'm because maybe I'm more of a Poland first guy. I always say, know the world, but before you know the world, make sure you know your own country fairly well. Because if you don't know your own country, then once you're outside your country, it makes you look like an idiot, because sometimes foreigners know more about your country than you do. And I don't want to make the mistake of the so-called typical, with all due respect to my American friends, the American tourists, who sometimes are very clueless on foreign soil.
Guilty as charged.
Yeah,
well, I'm curious, is that why you decided to become a historian of Polish history, so that you would know your country's history better?
Well, my interest in history, I started reading a lot, especially on the medieval history of Poland when I was still in Canada. Lots and lots of books for Polish historians. So that sort of crystallized my interest. Although right now, if you were to say, am I a medieval historian? I'm not. I'm definitely a 20th century historian. And my master's paper was on a 20th century subject. And now I'm sort of requalifying myself, because the PhD, which I hope to defend by the end of this year, is on a completely different topic. It's in political science, and it deals with with American paleoconservatism, but in detail, it actually deals with the political thought of the American Conservative magazine, which was set up in 2002 by the great Pat Buchanan, among others, to actually give voice to conservative opposition to the planned invasion of Iraq. And the American Conservative has become an icon on the American right. I mean, great people associated with, like Tucker Carlson, for example. So it's become one of those symbols that over time has shown that, and this is one of the things that I wanted to, in a scholarly fashion, sort of prove in my PhD, is that there's no monolithic conservative movement in the United States, and a lot what passes for conservatism from the outside is really not conservatism. It's actually neoconservatism, which, if you look at it closely, has nothing to do with conservatism, rightly understood, so to say, right? So I would guess the Ron Paul, Pat Buchanan type conservatism that I think we all here respect and share in a way. So, yeah.
Right. I mean, Mitch McConnell would make Barry Goldwater spin in his grave. He'd be doing somersaults, right?
Yeah.
Lindsey Graham
indeed.
is not a Goldwater conservative. So I'm curious, since you spent so many years in Canada, did you travel much around the United States? Did you spend much time here?
I visited Florida. I was in Detroit. So I visited the United States twice. And when I was in Florida, it was actually 1993. It was for spring break, or as we call it in Canada, March break. And it was interesting because it was just a few weeks after the first World Trade Center bombing, which occurred in February. And we literally were traveling from Toronto to, in a Ford Taurus, 1989, Griswold family style, for all of those who like National Lampoon's Vacation, basically.
Yes, yeah.
It was me, my brother, my mom, my mom's friend, and her son. So it was the five of us in a Ford Taurus. And we traveled from Toronto to Florida in what, if you Google it today, was the storm of the century. We were going all the way through the East Coast, through Georgia, the Appalachians, all the way down to Florida. And in some of the hotels that we stayed, the Ford Taurus, the 89 model, that was a tank. That wasn't a car. They just don't make them anymore like that, literally. Right. It was a beautiful car. And we were actually towing people out of the snow from the motels who couldn't help themselves. So, we'd hook them up to the Ford Taurus, and we'd be literally doing services. I'm like, we should be getting paid for this. And no, don't think about that. But it was interesting. So we got to Florida. And the reason we went to Florida at the time was because I think there was a I forget which shuttle. It might have been the Columbia, the one that blew up, I think, in 2003, tragically, upon reentry.
Yeah, Columbia.
The Columbia was supposed to have a launch from Cape Canaveral on March 21st, I think, 93. So we went there to see the launch. We stayed in what's called, I think, the Seagull Motel on Cocoa Beach. So we set up chairs up there. It was like a scene from The Right Stuff, I was more interested because I didn't know it was going to be such a huge event, the launch. So everybody was looking at their Game Boy at the time. My mother's like, watch the launch, not the Game Boy. So we set up the chairs up there. And I remember Wolf Blitzer was on CNN, and all of a sudden they say, yeah, unfortunately, it's going to be delayed due to technical issues. So I'm like, we traveled all the way from Toronto in the worst snowstorm in American history, and you're telling me the goddamn thing isn't going to launch? Unfortunately.
No.
But at least we got to see Kennedy Space Center, Ron John Surf Shop, if I remember correctly. Yep. Enjoyed a lot of good food and spent the week in Florida, but unfortunately no launch. So
damn it.
Yeah.
But what
yeah.
a great way to see America, to drive all the way down from Toronto to Florida. You get to see.
Indeed.
you
It was
know,
it was
a
it
lot
was
of
a kick-ass
America that
adventure.
way.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
bet
will
it
remember.
was.
It was literally kind of like a Griswold type adventure, just holiday road basically. So yeah,
I
in that
bought a
tradition.
Ford Taurus 2 years ago. It only had 20,000 kilometers on it. It was like
Wow.
brand new. I
Wow.
got it for like $1,500.
Nice. Was it a station wagon?
No, four-door
Nope.
sedan.
Okay.
I flipped it. I sold it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's as I said, they don't make them anymore like that. It was really a different era.
Gone in
Yeah.
ages. So I'm curious about your politics. Have you always been conservative? Was it a journey for you? Tell me a little about your political evolution over your lifetime.
I think the core of my beliefs has always been conservative. So in broad strokes, God, family, country, pro-life, pro-family. At one point, and I think every conservative might have went through this phase in a way, because as Churchill once said, if you weren't a socialist at 16, you didn't have a heart. And if you're not a conservative at 40, you don't have a brain, apparently. So in my sort of experience, I had a libertarian phase, a very extreme libertarian phase in about 2006, 2007, where I said, God damn it, liquidate everything, the state taxes, everything, no unions, no nothing. But I sort of changed my optic when I was working at Walmart in Alberta, by the way, in 2008. My brother, that'll do it. Yeah. My brother, he used to be a member of the Royal Canadian Air Force. He's retired now. But there's a base in Alberta called Cold Lake. So I traveled for one summer just to spend 3 months with him. And the deal was, okay, you're going to live with me. We're going to chill out, but you're going to work. So I went to work at Walmart, the local Walmart. And that's where my sort of extreme libertarian views begin to change a bit, because I noticed that, life is not an Ayn Rand novel. And there's some nuances that you have to take into consideration. I think there are priorities such as the common good, for example, which is very much a thing in what's called Catholic social teaching, that it's not always, society is not to be looked at as a form of atoms that basically walk around and you could do whatever you want, and that freedom is the ultimate end. Freedom is important, but I think in the Western tradition, the classical thought came to a consensus, meaning that freedom does not mean that you do what you want, but freedom is the ability to do what you ought to do. So that's, I think, the difference between the tradition that came, I guess, out of the Enlightenment and the pre-Enlightenment tradition, which opens up obviously a huge discussion about, the nature of liberalism and so on. But in a nutshell, after that libertarian phase, I don't think I changed in any way. I think I became what you can call a sort of Polish paleo conservative. So basically, transpose everything that Pat Buchanan believes in into the Polish context. So,
that actually does compute. That makes sense to me.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't think, by the way, I don't think there's a bigger Pat Buchanan fan in Poland than me.
Is that right?
I won't be shy about that. As a matter of fact, one of, I think, the most profound moments in my journalistic life was in 2013 when I did my first interview with Pat. It was a written interview. Yeah, it was just after Tim Stanley published his biography, which I recommend everyone read. It's called The Crusader, The Life and Tumultuous Times of Pat Buchanan. Pat has always been a hero in my world because, he represents, I think, everything that, what we long America to be for, just American as apple pie in many ways. Plus, he's had that added quality, which was important to me because Pat Buchanan is also a Latin Mass Catholic. He doesn't hide that fact. He's very open about it. I remember memories. I think it was in 1996 when he was running against Dole in the Republican primaries. And my parents were pointing out, oh, there's this Pat Buchanan guy, he's very conservative. And he's really going against Clinton. And then after a few years, I remember seeing an SNL clip with him, and it was Pat Buchanan, Dole, and what was the guy's name? Steve Forbes, because he was also running in the primaries in 96. And SNL, it was still without the politically correct BS at that time. It was really
it was
raw
still
political
funny
humor
back then.
Yeah, it's still funny, but it was a hilarious clip about them fighting over a hotel room in the primaries. I encourage everyone to see it. It's really good. So I guess today you could I would say, there's a trend right now that sort of popped up after after Trump came into office called national conservatism. And for example, Yoram Hazomi has been very much propounding this this new theory of where you combine, I guess, the best elements of nationalism and conservatism to understand it as the point of political conservative activity is to conserve what's best in the culture, the nation, to pass it on to the next generations. And I guess that would be how I view things. So I want to contribute to saving everything that is right and noble in Polish culture, the patriotism, the family formation, the religious heritage, all that has made us what we are today and recognizably as Polish. Yes, even the cuisine. I'm a big pierogies fan. I hate McDonald's in Poland. I think they should be, liquidated. Although they have good coffee, I have to admit that. But so everything that basically combines into this common notion of Polishness and the physical elements of Polishness, i.e. the physical existence of the nation, the Polish state, which was fought for many centuries to exist even, to save all that and to pass it on to the next generations. And I think any conscious patriot in our country would subscribe to, I guess, this basic formulation of what I just said is my, I guess, fundamental political outlook.
It's interesting that you brought up Pat Buchanan. That's actually someone I've always had a tremendous amount of respect for. I don't always agree with him, but I
Sure.
respect him very much for his, he's been anti-war. He's been small government, traditionally conservative, which I appreciate. And, there's a great quote. I think I mentioned it to you recently. Hunter S. Thompson, the writer, he was covering the Nixon administration and he got to know Pat Buchanan very well. Talk about strange bedfellows. Hunter Thompson and Pat Buchanan, those two hanging out, drinking. Can you imagine? But they did often. And they became very, very good friends, like lifelong friends. They stayed friends until Hunter died. And he once said that Pat Buchanan was the only honest man in the Nixon administration.
You know what? There is that big possibility. I think, obviously the old man, as Pat calls him, had his troubles. Although my general opinion of Nixon is more positive, I think, because I like historical revisionism. I like looking at things from a fresh perspective. But generally, Pat, I think, an episode, I think it was in the 80s. And Pat was obviously virulently, raging against the so-called, the budding LGBT lobby at the time in the States. You had the AIDS epidemic and so on. So everybody knew where he stood. But I think it was when, I'm not sure if it was Andrew Sullivan, but a gay journalist became diagnosed with HIV. And he got an unexpected letter from Pat, where Pat said, I stand against everything you represent, but I hope to God that you recover and that you become well again. Signed, Pat Buchanan.
That's so Pat Buchanan.
That's so Pat. The level of discourse, right, where you could really go at it, but at the same time you remain civil, right? And I think that represents a standard that not only in the United States, but believe me, in Poland is also gone. That you'd fight it out, but you could share a drink, for example, in the lounge at the end of the day, and you would always remember that he's a fellow human being, especially if you're looking from a Christian perspective, right? Or as St. Augustine said, love the sinner, hate the sin, right? So I think that was Pat Buchanan, classic Pat Buchanan, right? And that's why I think he had a lot of admirers, even in the people who ostensibly should have hated him. When he was dumped from MSNBC in 2013, I believe, for his last book, Suicide of a Superpower, even Rachel Maddow came out and said, I don't agree with Pat, but he was like a father to me. Rachel Maddow, out of all people, And what's his name? Chris Matthews at the same time. He did a pretty good segment on MSNBC where he said, I sort of come from the same milieu as Pat, Irish, Catholic schools and so on. We sort of diverged politically. But the one thing that you could never say about Pat was that he was disloyal to his friends. He will always be loyal to his friends. And I guess that's one of the reasons why Pat's favorite movie is The Godfather, which he actually told me also that,
Really?
It is his favorite movie. Yeah.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Well, I know that about Pat is that he did cultivate friends all across the political spectrum. Damn likable guy. And I've met a lot of people in politics and in media over the years. Every time his name comes up, I've never heard anybody who actually knows Pat have a bad word to say about him. The only people who slag him are the people who've never met him and don't know him. Because if they knew him, they couldn't possibly dislike him. He's one of the most likable men in politics. Always has been.
Indeed. I think one of the reasons is because he doesn't approach you, and from reading his biography and his memoirs from Nixon's time, I think one of the key issues that we've lost, I think, in Western civilization is
being civil.
Yeah. Don't look at your fellow human being first and foremost as somebody who has opposing political views. Get to know him. Ask him about his family, where he works. Of course, you'll be divided by politics. You know where he stands. You know where he stands. But Pat's the kind of guy who could have a drink with with his worst enemies, with the worst Democrat who could be slandering him. But as long as you got to know him, I mean, can you imagine Rachel Maddow saying nice things about Trump? Ain't gonna happen. Can you imagine Keith Olbermann saying things about Trump? Ain't gonna happen. And I mean, there was actually an interesting report which came out from Politico. It was in 2017. It was a very extensive interview with Pat. The title was the ideas made it, but I didn't. So basically, he references that he was sort of like the prophet preparing the way for Trump in the 90s when he started talking about the unfair trade deals, immigration, the wars, in a way. So he was sort of like John the Baptist to Jesus Donald Trump in a way, right? Preparing the way. But he mentions in that interview something that was revealed only to that Politico reporter. If you recall, in 2000, when there was a race for who's going to be the Reform Party's nominee, and Trump was in the race, Pat was in the race, and I think Jesse Ventura was in the race also.
Yes.
And Trump said a lot of insane and stupid things about Pat back then. He called him, a gay hater, a Hitler lover, and so on and so on. So a few years passed. And lo and behold, in 2015, just as the primaries were getting to kick off, Trump called Pat personally and apologized to him for the things he said in 2000.
Oh, I didn't know he apologized.
Yep. Read that Politico article. As I said, the title is the ideas made it, but it's a very long interview with Pat. He really goes into the history of his life with Nixon, Reagan, his presidential history, and he mentions that episode. And I think it might have been the only episode where Donald Trump actually apologized to someone.
He's never apologized to anyone in his entire life, as far as I know. So this is breaking news, Michael. And
out of all the people, he apologizes to Pat Buchanan. So how cool is that? And then I remember when he was president and earlier on, he would retweet some of Pat's columns. So I think they mended their ways, which is good because I think, it was only natural for them. I mean, Pat publicly supported Trump in 2016 and 2020. So it was only natural for them to come back to being friends again.
Wow. I should probably let Rick pop a couple of questions in here. I've been hogging this interview, but you two Canadians, your Canucks need to catch up.
Well, you say you're a conservative. So what does that mean in terms of your views on the economy and economics? Are you like an Adam Smith kind of guy, like me, free markets?
In general, I tend to look at concrete results and the history of economic thought. I don't like to deal in abstractions too much. And I think a lot of what went wrong with economic theories that sound good on the face of it, like socialism, communism, libertarianism, is the fact that a lot of it is theory. But once you try to put it into practice in certain cultural contexts, it doesn't work. Now, obviously, I don't believe there's one matrix, one basically economic theory for the entire world. Nations have their own internal lives, their own internal histories, and you can't just say that, free market capitalism for the United States, free market capitalism for, Bangladesh. It's going to evolve differently. But I do believe there are certain inherent traits of any economic order because let's begin with the word economy. I mean, it has its roots in the Greek language, and it basically means to maintain the family household. That's the fundamentals of economics. So the family is sort of at the center of the word economy in a way. In my opinion, and the way I see economic, although I'm not an economist, by the way, and as Nixon, I think, once said to JFK, or JFK to Nixon when they were still junior senators, he said, who the hell wants to talk about tax rates when you have such an interesting foreign policy going for you, right? So I'm kind of, I kind of subscribe to that. But in terms of the economy, I would say I'm an economic nationalist. I do believe that it is in the interest of every state to put the material interests of its citizens and its state first. I could also sort of call it free market capitalism, but for Poland first in a way. So I do believe there is a hierarchy of institutions and entities that you have to take into consideration. I do think, for example, that foreign corporations should be paying higher taxes in Poland and not the same taxes as Polish corporations, or as unfortunately we're seeing right now, even lower taxes than Polish businessmen, for example, have to pay. I mean, that makes absolutely no sense. I definitely do not subscribe to neoliberalism in economics. I see some good points in libertarian thought, which I think can be combined into my worldview. I do see some good things also in socialist thought, which I think could be combined into my worldview. But I would say my worldview is Aristotelian, in the sense that Aristotle, the great philosopher, said, always look for the golden middle in everything. So I think socialism and libertarianism are two extremes, and I come at it sort of in the middle, which I think is the proper conservative approach. So I take the good things in socialism, the good things in libertarianism, and sort of put them into one of these big symbioses, which I think in a way corresponds to my Catholic faith and the social teaching of the Catholic Church, which is very rich and profound because it evolved over several centuries, and a lot of great thinkers like St. Thomas Aquinas, a lot of great Catholic philosophers contributed to this thought. So, and if you look at, for example, papal encyclicals, papal teaching coming all the way from Leo XIII. I mean, Leo XIII wrote an encyclical called Rerum Novarum. It was the first papal encyclical coming from Rome where he addressed the plight of the working class. And that followed on through other popes. So it's not as if the Catholic Church only deals in masses and rosaries. There's a profound also moral doctrine behind it, and it also transpires into the economy. So if I were to call myself, define myself as an economic nationalist, I think that would be the best term. I very much identify with the notion of what's called post-liberalism, which is prevalent, well, maybe not prevalent, but is an ongoing movement in the United States represented by such people as Professor Patrick Deneen, Sohrab Ahmari. Actually, he wrote an excellent book just recently, Tyranny, Inc. It's getting some pretty rave reviews. And you can find them, I think it's called Post-Liberal Order on Substack. They got a lot of intellectual firepower, those guys, which basically what they're doing is they realize that Trump as a person changed the game in terms of economic policy of the Republican Party, that we're moving away from the classical three stools of libertarianism, social conservatism, and or I would say maybe evangelical social conservatism, and a hawkish, strong national policy. There's a realignment on the political right. Trump began it as a person, but now we need to give it some intellectual foundations, and that's what these guys are working on: how to transform the Republican Party into a truly multiracial Workers' Party, which is a very prevalent notion, in 2016 and 2020. Trump, I guess, gets it, but he's not the man to lay the intellectual foundations for it. And I think these guys are doing a lot of great work. Sohrab, as I said, just published his book. Michael Lind, for example, The New Class War, an excellent book on the situation in the United States. He actually wrote a new one. I think it's called something about the danger of low wages. But Professor Michael Lind, very highly recommended author. And some of the trends that I'm seeing in the States, I think I want to bring to Poland also, because after 1989, when the problem with Poland was the guys who were advising us in terms of how we should restructure our economy were largely...
This was where I wanted to go next. So this is perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. So a lot of these guys that were advising our government after 1989, they basically, their recipe for everything was privatize everything. Everything. Now, Poland in the communist times, we had our troubles, obviously, but we were an industrial powerhouse, and rightly so, because we have the resources, we have access to the sea, we have a very capable working class, very capable intellectual class, and it worked for us to a great degree. I mean, obviously there were economic troubles, especially starting in the late 70s and early 80s, but just literally to privatize your entire economy and sell off, industries that were worth billions for a penny to some American capitalist who came in, and the first thing he did was to liquidate the entire plant and lay off people. I mean, that made no sense. Now, that's obviously in a nutshell. And I'm pretty sure Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who was, by the way, one of those advisors in the early 90s, he's actually come to see the light. And you probably know that he's become a very ardent critic of what are called the neoliberal model of globalism. Unfortunately, some of his other friends didn't follow suit, like George Soros, by example, who really wanted to see those changes happen in Poland. But right now, the thing is, we always in Poland, in the political realm, and some of my friends do this too, unfortunately, they look for standards, what to do in Poland, in other countries. So they say, they always put these Reagan quotes, government is the problem, or Margaret Thatcher and so on. I'm like, guys, it was a different era. It was a different country. Just because Reagan said government is the problem doesn't mean it transpires so clearly into today's problems in Poland. Now, obviously, the government is the problem in Poland because we have a government right now who almost got us killed in the war in Ukraine. But as a fundamental sort of theoretical construct, government can do a lot of good, right? I mean, there is a need for power, for organization. It obviously has its limits, but it does have its function. It does have its mission. So I'm definitely not into the, I wouldn't say limited government. I would say rational government. And I believe that there are countries in the world who gave us an example of good government that works. I used to poo-poo Michael Moore a lot. And I still do in many ways, but there's this.
So do I.
But he actually made a good quote at one point. I don't remember which movie this was. It might have been, what's that movie called? About the health industry in the United States, where he said,
"Oh, sicko." Yeah,
sicko. I think there's a sentence there. He said, we used to have good government in the United States. What the hell happened? And those were my libertarian days. So it's, he's a commie. He doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. There's never good government in the United States. But no, if you look at it, and Michael Lind, in his economic history of the United States, and a lot of others, prove that, yes, there was good government in the United States. And I think that's what Bobby Kennedy Jr. is talking about today when he says, the period from 45 to the late 60s. I mean, the entire world wanted to be American at that point. Why? Because you had a middle class. You had a house. You had 2 cars in the garage. The mother raised the children. The father worked at the Ford plant. They could afford the house. They could afford the car. They could afford to go to, Disneyland or Wally World. If you were the National Lampoon's family, it was a different country. And that came about because of government policies. Now, it doesn't mean that government formulated these policies, but government allowed these policies to flourish. But there was a national mission sort of in the collective mind of the United States that this is where we want to go. So that's the kind of model that I would want to relate to. And as I said, it puts the family right back at the center of economic thought. And I think that's the way it should be.
So in Poland, when we went through that transformation and Lech Walesa came to power and we had solidarity and there was all this hope that came from that. What you just described, I think, is what the world envisioned as maybe what Poland could become. It could become this free market, free society with that sort of cliched ideal in there. But today, when you look at what the country has become, I don't think it is quite like that. I haven't been to Poland, so give me your thoughts on what the country has actually become, because in many respects, I think from the outside looking in, Poland has become sort of a corporatocracy like much of the rest of the West, which is maybe not exactly what people had hoped for. Yeah.
In broad, very general terms, if you were to visit Warsaw before 2004, so before, as I like to say it, the European Union entered Poland, other people say the Poland entered the European Union. I like to turn that around a bit. And you were to look at the downtown Warsaw. It basically resembled downtown Warsaw with the socialist architecture from the late 80s. There wasn't much change. After 2004, you would, and right now especially, you would see the growth of these huge skyscrapers, which was nice because, you want to have a modern city. But none of these nice skyscrapers were Polish companies or Polish firms, Ernst & Young, for example. So, and I think that view of the Warsaw downtown section very nicely resembles what happened to Poland. Poland became an economic colony for Western corporations. Now, not only American corporations, German corporations, but generally Western corporations, because I think the goal was, if you deindustrialize Poland, it's interesting because what Trump appealed to in 2016, especially in terms of the Rust Belt, the economy going down, the old states with the industry, the factories moving out to China and Mexico, we actually, I could relate to that because we experienced that in Poland right from the beginning, from 91. You had entire industries being shut down. You know, sugar used to be a big thing in Poland. No Polish companies produce sugar anymore, basically, at least not on a scale as we used to. The shipyard industry in Gdańsk, where Solidarity, you know, arose, gone basically in foreign hands. So the arms industry, another big thing in Poland, also pretty much gone. Right now, we have become a service economy with a few important industries. For example, our huge energy conglomerate, which is called PKN Orlen, that still remains in state hands. But I think a lot of state industries that are crucial for the national security of the Republic of Poland and for the well-being of our citizens are gone, unfortunately. The banks, the banking industry, massively privatized by foreign capital. So we've become a service economy. Western corporations came to Poland in 1989, obviously because of the cheap labor. And we really haven't returned to that ethos of made in Poland, so to say. A lot of people sort of intuitively understand it, especially after the European Union, because after the 2004 when we entered the EU, because we noticed that, okay, everybody thought the EU was going to be this cosmopolitan projects where boundaries and borders are erased, and nobody really cares about national identity more. But all of a sudden, we see that, okay, we started traveling all over Europe, Western Europe especially, and we see that, the French are still pretty damn proud. The Spaniards are still pretty damn proud. The Italians are still pretty damn proud. The British were so proud they left the EU. And all of a sudden, there's this dawning realization that, wait a minute, so we can still retain some of our national identity in the European Union. But at the same time, you're saying, yeah, guys, it was obvious from the beginning that the European Union is a club of nation states fighting for interests. But because of our naivete, which also was on display when we were begging to enter NATO, which happened in March of 1999, it sort of showed the political immaturity of most of the political media and political elites, whereby if we don't raise our voices too much, if we become loyal servants of foreign capitals, Western capitals, all will be nice and dandy in Poland. But all of a sudden, we noticed that after 2004 especially, and I think this is also a sign of the times, it was only after 2004, basically, where LGBT pride parades became a thing in Poland. You didn't have that before 2004. Now, obviously, everybody knew there were homosexuals in society, there were gay people, lesbians, whatever, but there weren't organized parades. Nobody brought that out of the closet, so to say. After 2004, all of a sudden it became cool. Why? Because you had money coming in from the West that was supporting this cultural subversion, this new culture war, so to say, in Poland. So that's been embedded into our national conscience, for better or worse. And there are other things that are being pushed just the same as in the West. So the transgender thing is slowly creeping into Poland right now. As a matter of fact, even when this was kind of silly, though, because it's not on such a massive scale as the LGBT lobby, for example, but it was still there when George Floyd was killed in the States, and you had that happening. Other people lying in front of the American embassy with, BLM. Like, you're in Poland. What the hell does BLM have to do with you? It's like, oh, but we want to be so Western. We want to be in tune with those movements, right? Well, think of something more original, right? I don't know, Save the Forest in southeastern Poland or whatever. So to answer your question, Rick, we still haven't left the sort of model where we are not investing into the Polish economy and building our own capacity with the resources that we want, which would remain in Polish hands. We are still, to a large degree, a service economy of Western corporations and Western banks, unfortunately, and the Western arms industry, which is very important, especially in light of the current war in Ukraine. Because basically everything we're buying right now, we're buying from the United States, apart from some tanks that we bought from Korea. And we're not buying the best from the United States, because I think any country that decides to invest in the F-35 should have their head examined. But I guess that's a different topic for discussion.
Right. So you've sort of traded, I guess, a secondary role under a Soviet system for a similar kind of subservient role under Western rule.
Yeah, people realize that, it's cool to travel around Europe without a passport. But it's also nice to go back to a country where, the wages are the same as in Western Europe, for example, right? And that didn't materialize. So we traded a lot of strategic assets and elements for things that I think were more related to, just issues of comfort. I mean, I have nothing against borders. I mean, so what if I have to show a passport at the border? That means I have a country if I have borders, right? Open borders, in essence, aren't a good thing. I'll subscribe to what Peter Hitchens said here, that if you don't have borders, you don't have a country. It's fairly obvious. But if you talk to an older generation of Polish people, like my parents, for example, and I'm starting to see there's a new trend even in Polish historical outlook. Some would call it revisionism. I would just say, looking at the 50 years of communism in Poland from a fresh perspective, you would see the sentiment where people would say, you know what? Yeah, there was hardship, obviously, back in the day, but families were close-knit. Society was conservative. We had a 1 million-man army. People had jobs. There was industry. There was things we could be proud of. And sometimes when you ride, for example, through regions of Poland where you just see basically abandoned, desolated factories that at one point, employed whole towns and villages. It's like riding through Ohio, deindustrialized towns. Maybe the scale of, for example, fentanyl drug taking is not as big as in the United States because Poles had the option of immigrating to Western Europe to work. But yeah, there was one of the problems, I think, after 2004, the European Union was also not only internal problems in Poland with the structure and character of our economy, but the fact that we had a huge brain drain and people just, doctors, people with degrees would leave Poland for better wages in the West. Which is we're seeing this on a massive scale in Ukraine right now, and in the Baltic states, which are being heavily depopulated. If things continue at that rate, you're only going to have Russian speakers in Estonia and Latvia, which they want to kick out by force in some of those countries. There was a theme in 2004. By the way, that was my first vote that I took part in 2004, is the referendum on entering the European Union. And my parents and I, we traveled to the Polish consulate in Toronto. We voted against entering the European Union. But I remember there was a slogan at that time. It was a slogan, yesterday Moscow, today Brussels. So basically it just shows, yesterday we're subservient to Moscow and today we're just changing our allegiances, which I think to a degree is exactly right.
Right. And so you sort of, I think, touched on the edge of this, but what about today and this war in Ukraine and people leaving Ukraine? How is that impacting Poland?
Well, before the war, because of the Maidan revolution in 2013, 2014, we already had a huge influx of cheap labor from Ukraine coming into Poland. So up until that time, what you would see was Ukrainians, for example, would come to pick fruits, for example, in the summertime. They'd make some money, they go back to Ukraine. But after 2014, because of the tragic state of the Ukrainian state at that time and the war which was raging in the Donbass, before February 22nd, 2022, we had about 2 million Ukrainians already here. Now, those are the ones that were legally here. I can't account for how many were illegally here, but I'm pretty sure that number was significant. Right now, my estimation is that there are about, with the influx of the Ukrainians after the war began, I would say the number is around 3.5, maybe even 4 million Ukrainians currently in Poland. Now, some of these Ukrainians have declared that as soon as the war ends, they're going to go back to Ukraine. Some have declared that they're going to stay in Poland. Now, this has generated a lot of controversy recently because, first of all, to take in such a huge influx of foreigners into a fairly coherent ethnically country is, well, it's going to create a lot of problems. We're a very homogeneous country in terms of ethnicity. That was, I guess, one of the blessings of communism, that we didn't have to experience multiculturalism as Western Europe did, sometimes in tragic ways, because obviously you had, terrorism associated with it and so on. But the problem with such a rapid influx of Ukrainians into Poland, they're manifold. Because first of all, wage pressure on Polish businesses has lowered, because right now you can hire cheap Ukrainian labor and you can tell the Polish workers, well, if you don't like it, I'll just hire 3 Ukrainians to work for me, So that has changed a lot in the labor market. It has destabilized the labor market. there are a lot of greedy entrepreneurs out there who want to have the cheapest labor possible because they need a third Mercedes in their garage. They don't take into account the long-term interests of, their local community, the local workers. So the more Ukrainians, the better for them. But this has also created problems in the cultural sphere because the public sphere has become, in many ways, what I would call Ukrainianized. If you walk around any major city in Poland, you'll hear a lot of Russian on the street. You'll hear Ukrainian on the street. You'll see billboards in foreign languages, in Ukrainian mostly. You'll see Ukrainian flags all over the place. As a matter of fact, up until recently, there were Ukrainian flags standing right beside Polish flags, on par with Polish flags in the Polish parliament, which is totally against any kind of flag protocol, so to say, which is enshrined in law. And what happened last week was, because the government is finally realizing that there is skepticism, to say the least, against this huge influx of Ukrainians into Poland on the rise, they took those flags down in the Polish parliament. By the way, I was in Warsaw, I think, 3 months ago, and in the headquarters of the National Bank of Poland, which is, I guess, the equivalent of the Fed, and every window was marked as a Ukrainian flag. I look at the picture yesterday from a live cam. It's all the flag. The Polish flags have all of a sudden returned. The elections are coming. So they took notice of the skepticism. So, but going back to your question, so it has created economic troubles, because you're obviously going to have a fight for wages now, and Polish workers are going to have competition with these influx of Ukrainians, millions of them. Cultural problems, whereby people are saying, hey, I'm not recognized in my country anymore. Nobody's speaking Polish in my neighborhood, or in my, in my block, or in my apartment building. And third, which I think is also very important, and this was actually noted by a very mainstream newspaper, I guess I would call the equivalent of the Polish, the New York Times in Poland. It's called Rzeczpospolita. There was a headline which made waves, I think a month ago. It said, the majority of crimes that are being committed in Poland by foreigners are being committed by Ukrainians. So you can see where we're going with this. And if you take into consideration that, as it was reported a few days back, about 15 million small arms are at the disposal of Ukrainian civilians right now in Ukraine, well, you can paint the picture for yourself where some of those weapons might be going, or through what country, or what could be done with those weapons. And right now, because there has been some formal tension between the Polish and Ukrainian government, finally, some would say, after a year of kissing Ukraine's you-know-what, or to be more precise, kissing Zelensky's you-know-what, there's been a lot of troubling signs coming from the Ukrainians that, hey, you know what? We remember what we did to you in Volhynia. We remember Stepan Bandera. And by the way, if you act up again, who knows? Maybe we could do a repetition of that. So those kind of vibes are being observed among some Ukrainian
time. What's about time?
And I told this to, I was discussing it with Clayton Morris. And in my opinion, it's more of an election gamble, because they've come to terms. There was even an article that Jarosław Kaczynski was basically the head of the ruling party in Poland, Law and Justice. So in essence, he's the head of state. The president and the prime minister are only puppets. It's Kaczynski who's calling the shots. There was a report where he had an internal meeting, and the advisors were telling him, look, we have a party to the right of us called Confederation. They're a big opposition party, and they're talking about the problem of Ukrainians. We can't ignore this, because our electorate is already noticing the problem of basically the huge influx of Ukrainian, some call them immigrants. I would actually call them settlers in Poland, because they're resettling them basically. And Kaczynski took note and said, okay, we're going to pretend right now that we're very pro-Polish. So they took the Ukrainian flags down in the Polish parliament. They started this nice hashtag on Twitter, Poland is most important, or Poland first. But I'm not buying it. I think, and even the prime minister, by the way, has changed his tune. There was an interview, I think yesterday, he said, by the way, we seek peace and harmony with all countries, including Russia, which is something he would not have said, a month ago. Obviously, he made a caveat that, but, we have to support Ukraine, but he placed Russia in the context of a country that we're not aiming to destroy anymore or conduct regime change, but that, we want to have peace and harmony with Russia. So you can see that they're changing their tune. Now, as you know, or might not know, there are parliamentary elections coming up on October 15th in Poland. We might be doing an election night special. I don't know, maybe we can coordinate, do something about that, to talk about the ground game, what's happening on election night. But they're feeling the heat in Warsaw that, we might have taken this a little bit too far, 4 million Ukrainians in Poland. and more coming, and getting all the benefits that Polish citizens have, and entitlements and so on. Yeah, that's irking a lot of people. So maybe we should cut back at least on the rhetoric. So on the level of rhetoric, I have noticed a change, that they become less hawkish than they were 2-3 weeks ago.
Makes you wonder if they're just doing that until after the election, and then they're going to ramp things back up again, right?
Knowing these people, and I know some of them personally, and knowing how they like to pose as conservatives and nationalists, I would expect that after October 15th, if they were to win a majority, which I think they won't, they would go back to the same old, or do something as stupid as, you're probably hearing the rumors of doing an incursion into Ukraine or Belarus. So.
Right. Well, I was listening to that conversation that you and Rick were having, and since you're a historian, let's talk about that history a bit, because as you know, and I know, and I think a lot of our viewers know, Ukraine and Poland have a very complicated history. Where shall we start, Mike? Do you want to start after World War I, before World War I? How far back do we want to take this?
Well, I think we can start in the 17th century. So
there you go.
Let me just make another coffee. In a nutshell, Poland used to be run as a kingdom. We had our kings, and the pinnacle of Polish greatness was it began in the 16th century, but the pinnacle was the 17th century, when we literally were an entity that stretched from sea to sea. So from the Baltic to the Black Sea. And because of that, the Polish kingdom, or the first republic, as it was called, actually, the Rzeczpospolita, that means republic in Poland, incorporated a lot of national ethnic groups. Now, the three major groups were Poles, Lithuanians, and what was at that time called Ruthenians, from Ruthenia, right, and which we call today Ukrainians. So at one point, these three ethnic groups composed one huge country and one huge state. However, in the second half of the 17th century, and anybody who wants to do a deep dive into Polish-Ukrainian relations, I encourage you, I think you could stream it right now with English subtitles. There was a very epic Polish movie made based on a very famous novel by a Polish guy who, by the way, won the Nobel Peace Prize for Literature, Henryk Sienkiewicz. It's called With Fire and Sword. And it basically shows the history of the Cossack rebellions that took place in the 17th century against the Polish rule at that time. The Cossacks were a formation of Orthodox Ruthenians, today they would call them Ukrainians, who were sort of, and the CIA has turned off my lamp, but I think you could still see me, who were very militant. They were used for many years as the sort of defensive outpost of Poland's southeastern borders, especially as it relates to the Turks and Crimea, which at the time was under Tatar rule. So unfortunately, in the 17th century, the Polish nobility and the Polish authorities wanted to register these guys as peasants. So they wouldn't have compensation as veterans, as warriors. They would be registered as peasants within a sort of what you would call an official registry, and in terms of tax polity and so on. These Cossacks really didn't like being treated like peasants. They started a rebellion. The head of the rebellion is a famous guy who's today being, he's a superhero, a superstar in Ukraine. His name was Bogdan Khmelnytsky. He actually has a nice monument in Kiev. So he was sort of the first, I would say, founding father of modern Ukrainian national identity. That's sort of where it all began. So you had this rebellion, and at that time, Khmelnytsky, because he was fighting with the Poles, he at one point actually swore allegiance to the Russian Tsar, because he believed that only the Russian Tsar would be able to guarantee the Cossacks' autonomy, the Cossacks' Orthodox faith, and everything that went along with it, culture, language, and so on. So that's where the sort of political integration, on the other hand, between Ukraine and Russia begins, thanks to Bogdan Khmelnytsky, which is kind of ironic if you think about it, because Khmelnytsky, even by Ukrainian nationalists, is considered a hero. But this is the guy who pledged allegiance to the Russian Tsar. So never understood how that
is
dichotomy could
interesting.
sort of, could go about. Like I understand Stepan Bandera because he was fully fledged nationalist, but Chmielnicki was sort of the guy who began it. So really fast forward to the 17th, 18th century. Poland was obviously partitioned for 123 years. We regained our independence formally in 1919, thanks to the Treaty of Versailles. But because we had a different geography than we have now in terms of maps, we incorporated a lot of what is today Western Ukraine, including obviously the town of Lvov, or Lviv, as the Ukrainians say. And when World War II broke out, you have to understand that before the war, the Ukrainian nationalists under Bandera and under the ideologue of, what was the guy's name? Shuhevich. Yeah. Shuhevich. I forgot his first name, but I know that his grandson, I think, is currently...
Andrei?
No. I have to look up the name, but I know his grandson, I think, is currently a Ukrainian parliamentarian. He's a sicko, by the way, but that's a different story. Anyway, so before the war broke out, Ukrainian nationalists, because they were organized as a militia, they sort of acted as an Ukrainian Al-Qaeda within the structure of the Polish state. So they would conduct terrorist attacks. They actually managed to assassinate a Polish minister. And by the way, that's why Bandera landed in jail for the first time, because he took an active part in killing that minister. His name was Pieracki. So 1939, all hell breaks loose.
Nicola Lebed was also involved in this.
Yep, indeed. I guess the main structure of the Ukrainian nationalist war was called, the organization was called OUN, so the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, Organizacja Ukraińskich Nacjonalistów. And they were very much based in Western Ukraine. So their basic ideology was greater Ukraine, racially clean Ukraine, and oh, by the way, anything that they used to refer to, for example, religion, the Christian religion, was only in name only, because there was actually a bishop at that time who is eerily forgotten by current Ukrainian authorities. His name was Bishop Gregory Homyshin. He was a Greek Catholic bishop based in Western Ukraine, and he saw the very sort of paganistic nature of what these guys were doing or trying to do. And he warned in his pastoral letters to the parishes saying, stay away from these guys. They have nothing Christian about them. They're terrorists, they're murderers. And if they get their way, there's going to be a lot of blood, basically. And that's what happened. After 1939,
yeah,
that's exactly what happened. In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, 17 days later, obviously the Germans come in on 1st September 39. The Soviets enter on September 17th. So Poland basically ceased to exist. And all of a sudden, the Germans realized that they have a very loyal and fervent ally in the Ukrainian nationalist movement, which found a lot of overlapping elements in their ideology with the National Socialist movement in Germany. So these guys began to be used as sort of agent provocateurs and a sort of a secret, well, maybe not so secret, because they had formal SS formations, these Ukrainians, which they were embedded to. But they were sort of the eyes and ears of Hitler on the ground of what was happening in Ukraine at the time, even before the start of Operation Barbarossa in June of 1941, which is obviously the German invasion of the Soviet Union. But in 1943, in the region of Volhynia, which today is Western Ukraine, they finally moved upon the Polish population, the Ukrainian nationalists, and embarked on a campaign of ethnic cleansing. They believe that the only way to create a greater Ukraine is by expelling everyone who is not a pure-blooded Ukrainian out of there. So obviously Poles were the first to be targeted, but you had also Jews that were being killed on a massive scale, Czechs who were living in Western Ukraine, Hungarians, and even other Ukrainians who did not subscribe to the nationalist ideology of Stepan Bandera. So as a result of this ethnic cleansing campaign, around 200,000 Poles were slaughtered. And I really mean slaughtered. And with all due respect to the victims of the wars in, Yugoslavia, the Hutu and the Tutsi, those were even a walk in the park compared to the level of barbarism that occurred in Volhynia. For anybody interested, just Google Volhynia massacres. And if you're more of a movie buff, there's actually a movie which came out a few years back by a Polish director called Wołyń, which basically means Volhynia, and it basically documents the history of this couple in the context of the massacres that took place. And after 1945, and after all those deaths in Volhynia, obviously Hitler is defeated. The Ukrainian nationalist movement went into underground, but they still wanted to conduct anti-Soviet operations. So the new Polish state that came about after 1945 under obviously the patronage of the Soviet Union, which is called the Polish People's Republic, officially the communist state. They had a problem because in southeastern Poland, within the new borders that were drawn by Stalin, you still had those militias running around and killing Poles and killing the newly established security authorities. So what happened was in 1947, the communist authorities, they initiated what's called Operation Vistula, whereby they would take the Ukrainians living in southeastern Poland who were sort of providing the militias with food, with housing, with security. They were sort of the ground game in that region. And they transported them to the west of Poland, to the west of the Vistula River, hence the name Operation Vistula. And they transported them mainly to 3 provinces. So Lower Silesia, where I'm based, Western Pomerania, and the Mazura regions in northeastern Poland. So they were dispersed because the UPA did not have local support anymore. They basically fell apart. A lot of these guys managed to escape to the west. Obviously, we know that Stepan Bandera managed to escape to Munich, where he was placed under OSS protection until one day a certain KGB agent assassinated him.
Yep, with a little cyanide.
Yes, exactly. And Bandera was buried in Munich. And after around the 50s, even though their sort of outward militaristic activity was drawn down, they still, managed to keep their cordial relationship with the Central Intelligence Agency. And through a lot of Ukrainian diaspora organizations, mostly based in Canada, but also in the United States and other parts of the world, they basically conducted an espionage anti-Soviet operation that lasted until Ukraine declared its independence in 1991. So obviously that's, a huge story right there. We know, Rick, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with the history of, what's her name? Not Victoria Nuland, but her ideological... Chrystia Freeland, yes. I mean, her grandfather was the editor of a Nazi newspaper in Krakow in Poland. And it's interesting. I think Poland should make a movie about this one day. But after the war, Polish intelligence was actually looking for this guy. They wanted to try him. And it turns out he died on a farm in the 1980s, if I'm not mistaken, on a farm somewhere in Alberta. So that just goes to show you how, you collaborated with Hitler, but you're useful now. So why not? Why not? And there are many examples to go around of that. I heard stories from Polish immigrants who came, so old timers who came to Canada after the war in 1945 because they couldn't go back to Poland, because fighting on the side of the Allies, if you came back to Poland in 45, you could have trouble, unfortunately. So they immigrated to Canada en masse, and they would tell me that they would see a lot of the guys who they heard about while fighting in World War II, these Ukrainian nationalists, these murderers, living their lives out in Canada, nice houses, baby boomer houses, and just, living the Canadian and American dream. You basically had Nazi collaborators in your neighborhoods that nobody took notice of. You hear these things. Obviously, there was a difference because I guess there were 2 waves of Ukrainian migration to Canada. You had the first migration in the 19th century. They settled out there in Alberta on the prairies because it sort of reminded them of the steppe in Ukraine. But then you had the more nationalistic elements that came after 1945, and some of these guys were basically openly working for the intelligence apparatus of the West, and especially the United States. And today, because you asked me about the history of Polish-Ukrainian relations, Lori, there is a realization, I guess I would say, on par with, you might have heard of the Katyn massacre, whereby the Soviets, they murdered, a couple of thousand Polish officers in 1940. However, the Soviets, especially in the 1980s with Perestroika and Glasnost, they came out clean about this. There was a formal apology. Yeltsin opened up the archives. There's a beautiful cemetery in Katyn today. The Russians opened it up. Any Pole is free to visit. There are graves. These soldiers that were murdered by Stalin's henchmen are commemorated the way they should be. Not the same in Ukraine. The Volhynia victims they don't have graves even today. As a matter of fact,
they're still arguing about it to this day.
Yeah,
to this day.
There are teams of Germans who are going right now into Ukraine to do exhumations on German soldiers on Ukrainian soil, but Polish authorities aren't allowed to do exhumations on Polish victims of the Volhynia massacres. So that just goes to show you how much of an ally we have in the Kiev regime. As a matter of fact, a few weeks ago when we had the anniversary of the Volhynia massacres, the Polish prime minister, He went to Ukraine. He went to a field, basically, which at one point was a Polish village. It's only shrubs right now today and a small part of forest. And he took these 2 pieces of wood, he made a cross, and he put them in the ground. Okay, that's nice, but how come there was nobody there from Zelensky's government? Nobody. There was no minister, nobody. There was no official apology. There were only vague expressions of, yeah, our history is complicated.
I've heard them say stuff like
our
that.
history is complicated. Bandera was also a complicated figure.
He was
We have to take it into
misunderstood.
consideration. And oh, by the way, if you talk about Bandera, it plays right into the Russian narrative. So don't talk about Bandera because they want to divide us. But you know what? I'll say it right here. I mean, God bless that guy who took out Stepan Bandera. To me, he's a personal hero. So go.
Right.
You know what? Anybody who thinks otherwise, I don't want to go into my Scott Ritter mode right now, but you know what I was going to say, right? There you go.
Fired
So,
up too.
Anything that contributed to the liquidation of those bastards has a green check mark in my book. Forget about it. So,
You probably know this interesting little factoid about the murder of Stepan Bandera. Was that he was killed one day after his visa had been approved to travel to the United States to do work for the CIA. I don't know
Why
if you
am I
knew
not
that.
surprised?
It's kind of interesting. I just ran across that little tidbit recently, and I thought it was fascinating because his pal Mykola Lebed had already come over here in '53.
Yeah.
And they had been working for several years to try and bring Stepan Bandera to the States to do work for the CIA. But there was resistance inside the CIA because they knew about Bandera. And a lot of folks in the CIA said, that guy is too wild for us. We don't want to associate with him. But eventually they were convinced to bring him over. And it just goes to show you that you couldn't fool the KGB. They knew exactly what was going on. Stalin's spies were everywhere. And they knew that his visa had been approved and that he would be coming here. And Khrushchev said, no, he's not.
That was a nice middle finger to Langley from the Russians, definitely.
It was. It was like, we know what you're up to. So when you were in Canada, were you aware of the Banderites and this Ukrainian diaspora in those years, or did you learn later when you went back to Poland?
Obviously, if you live among Polish immigrants in the West and in Canada in post-Soviet times, what you would mostly hear about was Soviet atrocities, which obviously took place, but that was, I guess, the mainline argumentation. I think I came across Volhynia and Banderism somewhere in the late 90s when I read a book. It was written by, it was a Polish book, but it was translated into English by a Polish historian. I think the title is We Shall Never Forget, which basically, it was the first attempt to document every single Pole or Polish citizen that was murdered in Volhynia at that time. So with names, date of birth, where he was killed, his family members, and so on and so on. So even the parishes that they were registered to, because at that time, after 1945, one of the things that you could use as an accounting source for who was where were actually parish books, because if you were living out there in Western Ukraine, the most important institute that you were registered to was your local parish. That was, I guess, the local priest. The local pastor was sort of the capo di tutti capi of the local community. What shocked me at that time was the numbers, because it was, ranging from 180 to 200,000. I personally think it was closer to 200,000, but I also at that time became associated with a group of Polish immigrants who came after the war to Canada, and these people were deported to Siberia after 17 September 39. They managed to escape the Soviet Union, many of them with the Second Corps of General Władysław Anders, who later joined up with the Allies and fought the Battle of Monte Cassino, where we routed the Germans. It was in the Italian campaign. And then Anders obviously immigrated to London, but a lot of his soldiers and a lot of his companions immigrated to Canada also, Halifax, Toronto, Montreal. And so these people who had the Siberian experience, they created what was called the Association of Polish Eastern Provinces, because most of the people that were deported to Siberia came from what is today Ukraine or Lithuania, so the former Second Republic of Poland. And as I became more associated with these people, they would relate the stories of what they remember or what family members of them remember from 43 to 45. As a matter of fact, this is no way, I hope, offensive, but you guys are old enough to remember Solidarity and the martial law in Poland, right? And
Yes.
the black-eyed general, right, Wojciech Jaruzelski, who was this monster for everybody to hate at that time, and still is to a lot of people in Poland. Those the vibes are changing. General Jaruzelski was actually pretty instrumental in rooting out a lot of these Ukrainian nationalists after the war, because he was a member of military intelligence after 45 as an officer. So he would actually do anti-Ukrainian nationalist operations in the Lubelski province, which is funny because you have a lot of these Polish neocons right now who, apart from accusing Jaruzelski of implementing martial law in Poland in 1981, they also accuse him, oh yeah, and he killed Ukrainian patriots, Ukrainian nationalists.
Mean to our Nazi
Yeah.
friends.
Literally, I remember a snippet whereby a Polish historian accused him of being very harsh in his interrogation techniques towards the Ukrainian nationalists. It was, oh my, you know.
I bet.
So yeah, that's an interesting little fact of life from General Jaruzelski's life also, yeah.
That is good stuff. I like
How
it.
much do you know about the Canadian government's, and I guess the legal system, and the way that they've sort of dealt with, or maybe not dealt with, the Nazi issue over the decades? Have you looked at it, and what are your thoughts on the way the Canadian government has? It's pretty clear, to me, that they've pushed this aside and made a lot of excuses when these people have been identified, and they're pulled into the legal system, and then there's always some legal excuse made, or has
Yes.
always been made. Do you think justice has been denied there?
I think Banderism and Ukrainian nationalism, as it was constituted by the OUN, Bandera and his ilk, should be treated the same way on the legal side of things, at least theoretically, as the crimes of communism. That would be my starting point. There obviously is a double standard here because, for example, a lot of these guys who immigrated to Canada, they served in concentration camps as guards. They were in the SS, Volhynia. Many of them had blood on their hands. They would come to Canada, they would settle. If you had Polish people who, there were some, obviously, which is a stain and a shame, and we're not afraid to say it. If you had Polish collaborators coming to Canada after the war, and it was proved that he was a guard in Auschwitz, for example, or served in the SS, these guys would be routed down as war criminals, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and they'd be found quickly, I'm pretty sure. But the Ukrainians, there was a double standard because they served geopolitical ends, which the Poles didn't have that kind of sharpness to them, so to say. I think the Ukrainian lobby in Canada can be compared to the influence of the Israel lobby in the United States.
Very powerful. Great
I
comparison.
think I think there is today, maybe with the exception of a southeastern lobby, like, for example, representing Canadian of Indian origin, for example. And by Indian, I mean India. But I think they're up there with the power of the Israel lobby, the Ukrainians, and have been for a long, long time. I mean, the Canadian-Polish Congress, which I had some dealings with, in terms of capital, in terms of influence, I mean, yeah, you'd have politicians coming to, our equivalent of Pulaski Day, the May the 3rd parade in Toronto, or 11th November, which is Polish Independence Day. They pat us on the back and they say, yeah, great job, Poles. Yeah, you'll enter NATO. And oh, by the way, we need the Polish vote in the next election. But, with the Ukrainian lobby, it's different. It's the Ukrainian lobby that tells them, yeah, we need to get this done, for example. You're going to send money to Zelensky, and we need to get Yanukovych out there. We need a realignment of Canadian policy towards Ukraine. I mean, Canadian policy regarding Ukraine, in many ways, I would say, is more radical from the beginning, from 1991, than American policy. I mean, if you recall, when George H.W. Bush came to Kiev, he gave a famous speech in the Ukrainian parliament, some call it the chicken hawk speech, where he said that we're not going to support any form of, well, I'm not quoting directly here, but basically any form of revanchist nationalism in Ukraine is not going to see the support of the United States, which is clearly an allusion.
What a lie. Total lie.
Yeah, total lie, obviously. Now, either he was being, he was being a hypocrite, or, James Baker took him aside later and said, no, Mr. President, that's not what we're going to do. But at least he said it publicly. You never heard anything come close to that.
CIA director. He knew all about this.
I'm guessing, he probably knew what he was doing. But as I said, even publicly, even the rhetoric from the Canadian side never amounted to anything even close to what Bush said, despite the fact that he might have been not saying it in good faith. I mean, the Canadian government, whether liberal, whether conservative, has always been on the side of that part of Ukraine that clearly identifies with Stepan Bandera and that entire tradition. I mean, hell, when they had one of those first demonstrations after the war, you had Chrystia Freeland standing there in her Ukrainian traditional garb and a guy holding the Bandera flag right beside her. I mean, why the hell? You could just as well hold a swastika right beside her, And think about what a lot of the Poles who are still living in Canada, Polish Canadians, maybe even some of the guys after 1945, when they saw that, what were they thinking, Who the hell are we associating with here? So I think.
So when you grew up in Canada, this stuff was not taught in school, so you had to find out about this and learn on your own
community, I
really,
guess.
right? Because it's I've noticed too that element, the Ukrainian element, it's quiet. It's the sort of the unspoken sins, right? You don't talk about that stuff. It's all under the surface. The Jewish community, they're always trying to bring stuff to the surface, but you just don't hear about this. And even if you listen to some of the rhetoric recently from Jordan Peterson, he came out and said he said Nazism is just not a thing in Canada. He said, I think he was sincere when he said it, because I don't think he's aware, as so many Canadians are. But if you're Polish or Ukrainian, you're maybe aware because your community knows the history, but it's not taught in schools. But if you're not from those specific communities, you're oblivious to it in Canada, which is a very strange, to me, phenomenon.
Thank you for pointing that out, because one of the influences on me in my sort of deep diving into Banderism and Ukrainian nationalism was, by the way, a Ukrainian Canadian historian. Unfortunately, he's been dead for a few years now. His name is Victor Polishchuk. I think he lived in Toronto, and he interfaced much with the Polish community in Canada. He published many seminal works on Ukrainian nationalism. I think he was the first one to actually publish Bandera's biography. His name is Victor Polishchuk. Polishchuk, you can Google that. And today, there's an interesting professor who does a lot of good work out of the University of Ottawa. His name is Professor Ivan Kachanovsky. Really good stuff. He's actually, I think, the only scholar in the world who has conducted an independent, fact-based investigation into who was doing the shooting in February 2013 on the Maidan from the snipers that were killing the protesters. Yeah, Professor Ivan Kachanovsky. He's got a YouTube channel. A Twitter handle. And I think if you're familiar with Oliver Stone's movie Revealing Ukraine, there are segments there where he speaks. Yeah.
Okay. So, yes. Now I know who you're talking about.
And Professor Kachanovsky is obviously he doesn't have no reservations in criticizing Banderism. And God rest his soul, Victor Polishchuk, Professor Victor Polishchuk, he did amazing work in times when in the 90s, even in Poland, it was still seen as politically incorrect to talk about voting. So we were actually getting a lot of those books translated and sent to Poland from a Ukrainian historian living in Canada. So those two I would definitely recommend. Yeah, thanks, Rick, for reminding me about that, because Victor Polishchuk was, definitely a big influence on my understanding of Banderism.
That's fascinating. I'd like to turn the conversation a little bit now to American politics. Even though you're not an American citizen, you can't vote here. I know you're very interested in American politics. And
well, wait, Lori. Well, why do you say I can't vote? I mean, maybe I can. Who knows?
Hey, anybody.
Send me a ballot. Send me a ballot.
You can just sneak across our southern border. So
there you go. There you
just
go.
Come on in. There are certain places I could direct you to where you only have to live there for 30 days and you can vote.
There you go. I'm just going to work on my Spanish and the habla inglesa, and that's it.
That's it. You can fit right in. Get you a sombrero. You'll fit right in. It's okay. We're
Indeed.
welcoming people from all corners of the world these days. You don't even
Indeed,
have to be
yeah,
Mexican.
literally from all corners of the world. I saw that documentary by Bobby on the situation in the southern border. It's like,
Oh,
okay, yeah, I understand Mexican, Puerto Ricans, but what the hell? People from Yemen, Bangladesh, Ukraine? What?
And a bunch
How did you
from
get here?
China.
Yeah.
What surprised me is how many are coming in from China
Yeah.
when it seems like their economy is humming along a lot better than ours. And so I'm not real sure why we're seeing such an influx, a large influx of Chinese migrants. That's very interesting.
That's one thing, but if you consider, the anti-CCP hysteria right now in the United States, I mean, if you're stopping anybody, you should be stopping these Chinese people, right? But no, they're allowed to walk through.
Just
So what the
come
hell,
on in,
Yeah.
come on in. So I was curious to ask you what you thought of the late breaking news of Trump's 4 indictments in Georgia, along with Rudolph Giuliani and 17 others. Any thoughts on that?
This is a mechanism to stop Trump once and for all from getting anywhere near 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
Do you think that Trump is his own worst enemy?
Yes, I do believe that. I talking to a lot of people good people, I guess our type of people, the real MAGA people who advised him, and reading a lot about his presidency, I think from a guy who is so easily open to, you're fired on television, you would expect that he'd be doing the same thing. Let's begin with, he wouldn't hire them in the first place, right?
Exactly.
I mean, I think a lot unfortunately changed after Charlottesville, where when Bannon was thrown out of the White House, because Bannon, I think, was the sort of was the guy who would always remind him, you're in here because of what you said in 2016, not because of Sheldon Adelson or the what's his name, or Grover Norquist, for example, right? You're here because you created a realignment. Don't forget that, and you have to center your policies around that. So I think when Bannon was out, I think that's when you saw the sort of unraveling. It's interesting because when Bannon was thrown out of the White House, one of the first things he said, I think it was to the Huffington Post, was the Trump presidency, as we knew it, has ended, basically. It's done. It was sort of a sentence along those lines. So I think he was his worst enemy. I mean, the nomination process, I think he kept a lot of his gut instincts, which I think one day might be revealed in what he said, or what Putin actually said to him during their Helsinki meeting, because I think that's a transcript for the ages, so to say. I hope to read that someday. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall. But notice that that press conference that he gave with Putin, I think, was one of his best press conferences ever, because he talked to the man, and despite the pressure coming from, the American journalists were asking the stupidest questions out of all the entire press pool, he kept his cool. He said, I trust them. I don't think they interfered. Do you have any evidence that they interfered? And that's when they really went at him, remember? I mean, the same day, oh my God, he didn't stand up to Putin, and so on and so on. I think I was at his Warsaw speech in 2017 in Warsaw. I think it was the best speech an American president gave in Poland, literally. I would change a couple of things in that speech, but I think it was a very conservative speech. He put in, I think Steve Miller had some insight into writing that, but he talked about open borders. He used phrases such as Western civilization. He talked about God. He talked about our shared inheritance. And it was really epic. It was good. The delivery was good. The reception was good. And the reaction, obviously, from the obvious people, oh my God, white supremacist comes to Poland and tells we have to defend our borders, right? So, but yeah,
they didn't know what was coming in a couple of years in Ukraine, if you want to talk about
exactly
white supremacists.
Exactly. But I think, yeah, if he was only open, if he wasn't the type of guy who, as they said, he would remember what the last person who left the room said. If he was a little bit more open-minded, spent a little bit less time on Twitter, and listened to strategic people who really wanted to, wished him the best. They weren't his enemies, and they were from the left and the right. I think the conduct of the first term would have been much better. At the end of the day, I totally agree that his character, his erratic functioning in the White House was his worst enemy, indeed.
Yeah. And, he just can't stop tweeting, even though he's not on Twitter. But when he puts out a truth, he gets himself in more trouble with the prosecutor.
Like
Every time he tweets, it's a new criminal charge.
So sometimes, when I see the reaction of his enemies, I'm naturally inclined to say, yeah, you hit him hard, Donald, right? But then when you calm down, you say, okay, so now getting back to the real world. I remember
moved on.
Yeah. I remember even Pat Buchanan in the early days of the administration, he wrote a column where he said, great, America first agenda, but you have to be more presidential, right? You are the president of the United States. You can't just run around and throw shit around, right? You have to be calm, cool, and measured. The bully pulpit, take this seriously now, right? So yeah, I think that was part of the game because it was easier for his enemies to make fun of him and mock him, right? You gave him sort of the argument, despite all of his other good qualities that he had, right? So yeah, it's a paradox.
So do you have a particular candidate that you favor in this race?
Well,
who do you like?
I like Trump, despite what we just said. I like Bobby Kennedy. I think, what is the African-American running there? Cornel West?
Oh, yeah. Cornel West, the Green Party.
Cornel has some interesting things to say that I think should be taken into consideration. But yeah, I wrote a piece not too long ago, basically asking Bobby Kennedy to come to Warsaw and give a peace speech.
Oh, on Scott Ritter's.
Substack.
Substack.
As you might recall, his uncle, President Kennedy, when he came to Berlin, he gave a famous speech. I think it was in the summer of '61, where he said those famous words, "Ich bin ein Berliner," which were then echoed by the famous character of Mayor Quimby in The Simpsons in one episode, where a German delegation comes over to take over the atomic energy plant, and Mayor Quimby, to show deference to his German friends and to impress them, says, "Ich bin ein Springfielder," which is hilarious. So I sort of wanted to make a Ich bin ein Varsovian version of that, and I encouraged Bobby to basically, as a candidate, to come to Warsaw, just like Barack Obama did in 2008. He came to Berlin, he gave a speech, although I think he already had the nomination, but he was still a candidate one way or another. He wasn't president. I basically encouraged Bobby to come to Poland and give a speech on peace and encourage Poland to play out the role of a unifier between East and West, which, by the way, his own father promoted in 1962 when he came to Poland. 1964, 64, in June 1964. Mm-hmm. He actually said in very clear terms in his statement after the visit that Poland, because it's formerly in the Soviet camp, but has so many connections with the United States, can play as a bridge. And I've always believed that. As a matter of fact, when I led this little campaign in 2000, and I think it was 17, when there were the first talks of a summit between Trump and what's his name, the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. Mm-hmm. I said, you know what? Organize the summit in Warsaw. Organize the summit in Warsaw. Let's bring the East and the West together. It's neutral ground for both of the countries.
Great idea.
It would be great. And by the way, Kim Jong-un's grandfather actually came to Poland in the 80s on a train from North Korea. Can you imagine driving all the way from North Korea to Warsaw through all of Russia? Yeah, there was a huge military parade for him. So it was something big. He could have related to that. I think we could have had good vibes working out there in Poland, showing itself as a true player on the international scene, promoting peace. So I had this hashtag, I think, Kim Trump Warsaw, something like that. Unfortunately, nobody took it seriously, but I think it would have been epic.
It would have.
And I think, we could have arranged things. I mean, we still formally have diplomatic relations with North Korea. We have an embassy in North Korea. North Korea has an embassy in Warsaw. So I think it would have worked out, especially if you consider historically that Nixon goes to China was an effect of policies that were tethered to in Warsaw, because Kissinger's secret meetings with the Chinese delegation, I think one or a few of them took place behind closed doors in Warsaw. So the groundwork for Nixon's visit to China, the opening to China in 1972, began in Warsaw. The talks took place in Warsaw between the Chinese and American delegations. So in a way, there is this historical role that Warsaw as a capital in Poland, because of our tragic experience in World War II, played in preventing any new world war, for example. And I think we should still play that role, especially that, what's happening in Ukraine is right next door in our neighborhood. with a nuclear armed Russia, we should be at the forefront, along with, good old Viktor Orban out there promoting peace. So in my little text there for Scott Ritter Extra, I basically called out Bobby and I said, Bobby, you need to come to Warsaw and publicly give a speech promoting peace on the lines of, Ich bin ein Berliner, and President Kennedy's speech at American University, which I think was one of the greatest pro-peace speeches in American presidential history.
Yeah, and I was on your show not long ago, and we had a good long talk about Jack Kennedy, the Kennedy assassination. We explored the various theories about that. I think we're both of the mindset that the CIA was involved, heavily involved, if not the architects of the whole operation. So I wanted to play you a clip. Bobby Kennedy had a long sit-down interview with Tucker Carlson this week on Tucker's new show on Twitter. Have you seen that yet?
Just before I went on your show, I started listening to that interview, but I only got to the part where they were discussing the Secret Service detail, which Bobby was denied.
Ah, yes, that's a whole nother story. But I queued up this particular spot because it's more about the JFK assassination. And well, I'll let Bobby pick up the story here. You'll see what he's talking about.
But what happened after that is then in 1979, the House Assassinations Committee met for a year and a half. And they looked at much more evidence than the Warren Commission did, including, Alan Dulles. Alan Dulles had run the Warren Commission. He was the head of the CIA who my uncle fired. When my uncle died, he said, I'm glad the little shit is dead. He thought he was a god. That's what he said to a young reporter. And then he becomes the head of the commission that is, it shouldn't have been called the Warren Commission. It should be called the Dulles, because Earl Warren had a full-time job at the Supreme Court. All the other guys on the Warren Commission had full-time jobs as senator and congressman. The only guy who went to every meeting and, looked at every piece of evidence and developed the questions for the witnesses was Alan Dulles. He was running the entire Warren Commission. And he should have been the prime suspect in the crime. And he was communicating secretly with the people at the CIA, with David Atlee Phillips, with George Johannides, who was the CIA liaison, telling them what questions were going to be asked and what they should reveal, and with J. Edgar Hoover at the same time. The whole thing was a coordinated kind of kabuki theater. But then Congress goes back and investigates it in 1979. And Congress then comes back after a year and a half, seeing a lot more stuff, and says, and they conclude this was a conspiracy.
Yes.
So they make that official. So anybody who says it was just Lee Harvey Oswald is differing from the people who actually made the investigation.
So given that,
most of the people on that staff who I've talked to believe that it was the CIA. And as you know, at that time, the dispute between them was the mob and the CIA, because there was a lot of mob involvement. Johnny Roselli, Sam Giancana, who was the Chicago boss, Santos Traficante, who was the Tampa boss, and Carlos Marcello, who was the New Orleans boss, were all involved. And they all had casinos in Havana. And they were working with the CIA to assassinate Castro. So they had hitmen at their disposal, and they were training Cubans who were sharpshooters for Batista as hitmen. And I've talked to some of the hitmen. I've talked to Antonio Vecchiano, who was involved, and who was also David Atlee Phillips' handler. David Atlee Phillips was his handler, and he was Lee Harvey Oswald's handler. So Vecchiano met Oswald in Dallas I think in September of 1963. I've talked to, the people who were actually working for the CIA and the mob at that time, to kill Castro, and how they were then pivoted to this, some of them were pivoted to this new project.
if you become president, what do you do about those 4 million federal employees, about the agencies which are running effectively as autonomous governments within our government? Like, how do you? The last president, when was the last president who controlled the agencies? And how would you do it?
I don't know. I feel like I'm probably, and I don't want to seem like, I'm being vain, but I feel that because of the confluence of my experiences over the past 40 years, that I'm actually probably the only one that can unravel that agency capture. And let me tell you this, my daughter-in-law, who is co-running my campaign with Dennis Kucinich, Amaryllis Fox, was a CIA agent in the clandestine service for most of her career. And what she'll tell you, and she has a very sanguine view of the CIA, and the same as mine, and also understands all this evidence that the agency, was involved in the murder of my uncle and the cover-up, continues to be involved in the cover-up. But what Amaryllis will tell you is that of the 24,000 people who work for the agency, that 20,000 of them are patriotic Americans and good public servants. And that there's some people mainly in a plants division. The espionage division of the CIA is made up of extraordinary people, principally who are doing an important job of protecting our country. The espionage division is the division that does information gathering and analysis, and the president needs that. The plans division is the action division. They're the ones that assassinate people, fix elections, overthrow governments, and do all the things that I think we're paying for in our foreign policy today and in our domestic policy. My father was going to separate those two divisions. My uncle ultimately was going to do that too. My uncle thought the CIA, he came out of his office during the Bay of Pigs and he said, I want to take the CIA, shatter it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. He then asked my father to run the agency. He said, you're the only one I trust to do this. And my father said it, and my grandfather said, you can't do that. You can't, it would be like Molotov and Stalin. You can't have the brother of the president running a secret spy agency with all this extraordinarily hidden power. So they brought in John McCone to run it, but John McCone, was not able to handle it. And my father, a week before he died, told one of his closest friends, Pete Hamill, who you may have known, that he was
Pete Hamill, the journalist?
Yeah, the journalist.
Yeah, of course.
He told Pete Hamill said, what are you going to do about the CIA? And my father said, I'm going to separate the plans division from espionage, and that's the only way to make it work. And that still makes a lot of sense today. Incidentally, I had dinner with Mike Pompeo, 3 weeks ago. And he said something really interesting to me.
Wait, you had dinner with Mike Pompeo?
Yeah, in Las Vegas. And he said something.
What was that?
It was the weirdest dinner I've ever been to. If I told you the other people were at that dinner.
Well, because I just can't imagine I know Mike Pompeo. I'm not attacking Mike Pompeo, but I can't imagine two people with more different views.
No, I've always, I have a kind of natal hostility toward Mike Pompeo, but I never knew him. But just because he was, for people who don't know, he was the CIA director and he was Secretary of State under Trump. But he's an interesting guy.
He's smart,
very smart. He's Harvard. I think he went to Harvard Law School and
he did.
Harvard undergrad, and I think he had a military career.
Army officer. Yep.
And he, he's by all. On paper, he's kind of a great American. By all, his CV is extraordinary. And you never know. You make judgments about people before you meet them. And my judgment about him, I still don't know what to think of him. But this, what he said.
You wound up at dinner. I'm sorry,
yeah,
Bobby Kennedy and Mike Pompeo in Vegas at dinner. If I'd stumbled across that, I would have stopped.
It wasn't just the two of us. It was the rest of the group makes the story even weirder. So I'm not even gonna. I don't know if I'll even go there. But he said to me before dinner, I had a moment with him, and he said to me, when I was at the CIA, I did not do what I should have done to fix that agency. And he said,
no joke.
And he was expressing regret, and he said. And then he turned to me and like looked me dead in the eye, and he said, the entire upper echelon of that agency is made up of individuals who do not believe in the democratic institutions of the United States of America. That's a quote.
But so it was Mike Pompeo who convinced Trump not to release the file. And it was a guy who worked for Mike Pompeo texted me the day after I revealed that those files showed CIA complicity in your uncle's death, which they do, because I talked to someone who read them. And I said that on Fox News. And I got a text from a guy who works for Mike Pompeo informing me that I had just broken federal law and that anyone who had told me that was a felon because we had revealed classified information. And I said, wait a second, that classified information suggests the US government was involved in the murder of an American president. Yeah, that's Mike Pompeo's position on that.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit weird for him to say, I think.
Well, there's 1 billion documents classified.
Yeah, I know.
Top secret. So, they can call it, they can stamp that stamp on anything they want to. That's a lawyer's trick, to put.
And he was also behind convincing Trump not to pardon Assange.
Yeah, well, that confirms my earlier assessment of Mike Pompeo.
That's interesting. You like him? No, it's a lot. Okay, so you have.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll just leave that there and let it sink in. What you just heard.
Yeah.
There's some breaking news there. What do you think, Mike?
Well, the first question that popped into my mind was I'd like to ask Bobby, was Pompeo sober when he told that to you? Apparently, people are more truth tellers when they're after a few stronger ones. So who knows if they met?
Veritas.
Exactly. And if you know Veritas, and if they met in Vegas, that would make sense, right? But who knows? It might have been Pompeo signaling to him, "Hey, I tried to do a good job. Just in case you become president, just remember me as a nice guy." I don't know. Maybe I'll escape to Israel or something. But well, it's interesting. I have no doubt I have no reason to doubt the veracity of what Bobby said, and it is interesting. But I also would love to find out who were the other members of that crew that he sat with in Vegas. Yeah, well, maybe we'll find out someday.
Yeah, he didn't want to name any names, but the whole story, and I'd heard about this dinner that he had with Pompeo a few weeks ago, and my response was the same as Tucker's. I was like, Bobby, what are you doing? What are you doing, man? I mean, he'll talk to anybody. And he had Mike Pompeo is a charming guy. He's a Kansas guy, and he knows how to turn on that farm boy charm. And I think
he's got the swagger. Yeah,
he does. I think that's how he weaseled his way into Trump's good graces. What I got out of that was him trying to weasel into Bobby's good graces too. But I thought Tucker did an excellent pushback on that to say, hey, last year when I did that story with my secret CIA source who has looked at these documents and it believes that the CIA murdered your uncle, Jack. It was Pompeo's guy that, texted me and said, you've just violated national security. You're mishandling classified information and your source ought to be in prison. And that's the exact same thing that Pompeo said to Megyn Kelly after Yahoo News did the story about how the CIA under Pompeo was planning to kidnap and or assassinate Julian Assange. Right. Yeah, Mike Pompeo said that Yahoo staff and the reporters and the sources should all be tried under the Espionage Act and imprisoned.
I'm curious. Have you guys come across this theory? I won't call it a conspiracy theory, but Tucker's old man, he had associations with the CIA.
That's right.
And I don't know where I read this, but it was. I think it was a source I reach out for fairly often. I'm not sure if it was Mint Press News or another one, but it was alleged that Tucker already had the knowledge of who killed JFK on solid grounds because his father confirmed that to him at one point. I don't know if you guys came across that.
No, version. I've never heard that.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly possible.
Because I think his father was head of Radio Liberty at some point, and Radio Liberty was obviously connected with Langley, and he never because I don't know if he was officially in an official capacity working with Langley or unofficially, but if it was Radio Liberty, then you had to had contacts with the Central Intelligence Agency. So that's just, as I said, just the thought that I threw out there, because I did come across a theory that Tucker sort of to push away the suspicion that I might have been, his father said it was a source, but he didn't say if the source was alive, if, it's so basically the
True.
Plausible deniability, so to say, right?
Well, that was my thought. I hope he was being damn careful with this source, like discussing nothing over electronic communications. When they had that conversation, I hope they were deep in the woods with no devices around. If there were any documents shared, I hope they were passed hand to hand, read, and then burned.
I think after Tucker realized the NSA was snooping on his discussions about a potential interview with Vladimir Putin, I think he took that into consideration. I hope he did, at least. Yeah.
Yes. They know every move he makes.
Yeah.
Well, we're just about out of time. Rick, did you have any questions for Mike before we go?
No, I'm just really glad that we finally got someone on the show who's not a communist and is
or a LaRouche person, right?
Yeah, that's right. And very much in alignment with where I'm at politically. So we're not strange bedfellows at all. We're definitely in the same camp, and I'm really appreciative of your time today.
Yeah, thank you guys once again. It was an honor to speak to your audience. I love your show. I've been following Maverick News and Strange Bedfellows. You guys are positively crazy. That's why I like listening to you. It's really an honor to be here. And I hope to come back sometime. I don't know. Maybe we could do a Christmas special, sometime in the future, for example.
Whenever you get your next holiday over there in Poland, right? Today's a holiday. That's why you're available.
Today's a holiday. Yeah. Then the next holiday is November 1st, All Saints, and then November 11th. But as I said, I mean, I'm really thinking right now about a possible sort of live transmission from Poland on election night, because I think a lot of people in the West are going to be watching that to see what happens, because a lot of stupid things that our government can do, unfortunately, might bounce back to policy preferences of your own governments. So I think we should be watching that closely, and I'll be doing my reporting, trying to get as much info as I can. But as I said, thank you once again for giving me the time and courtesy and just presenting myself. It was a real honor, and hope to see you guys again soon.
It is such a pleasure to speak with you. You're a delight. And where can people find you? Where can they watch your show, and where can they follow you?
Well, you can find me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @MGKrupa. You can find me on YouTube. We still have a channel. Still, hopefully, YouTube doesn't knock us out. Although, as I told Lori and Rick backstage, we are planning to install a new Rumble channel. So we have that under consideration to have in reserve. It's obviously something you should consider. So our YouTube handle is VotumTV, VOTUMTV. That's where you can find all my interviews. And by the way, spoiler alert, in September, we're going to be having a special guest on VotumTV, the one, the only Sean Stone, actor and son of the great Oliver Stone. So that'll be interesting and exciting. And we had a Canadian angle recently because we had Maxime Bernier also. So we're trying to be global in our outlook. And those would be, I'm just starting my Substack. So the only post that I put there was the one that Scott published on his Substack also, but I hope to expand that also. So the main two places where you can find me is Twitter @MGKrupa and VotumTV on YouTube.
Well, thanks again for joining us. You are a great guest. I knew this would be another delightful conversation. Last time it was just you and me, but this time I wanted to bring Rick Walker in because I knew that you two would have so much in common. And you were a perfect guest for Strange Bedfellows. And you're not really strange, maybe just a little strange, but not really strange.
No, one of the best episodes we've had.
Wow. Definitely. Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Most
Great to
definitely.
Hear that.
And we will see you back here again soon, or I'll be on your show. And we would love to partner with you on that election coverage in October. I'll definitely touch base with you about that and see how we can partner up and make sure that people over here in North America are paying attention, because they should be.
Indeed. I think it's, just to end off, I think it's going to be one of the most consequential elections in Poland after 1989. So definitely something to look out for.
Absolutely. It's going to have a lot to do with the future of Europe and this war. The leadership you get is going to have a lot to do with that. So once again, thank you. Thanks everyone for watching Strange Bedfellows, and we will see you back here next Saturday night at 9 o'clock Eastern. Good night, everyone.
In a universe full of ideas, we draw lightness from the dark to a place where opposites attract. Right meets left, positive touches negative, sparking an explosion of truth. Because politics makes strange bedfellows.
This has been a Maverick Multimedia production.